The carriage wheel snapped on the muddy road, and Elena Whitmore was thrown forward against the wooden seat, her heart pounding before she even understood what had happened. Rain hammered the roof of the small coach. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the storm, and then the whole carriage tilted sideways, with a groan of splitting wood. She grabbed the door handle just in time, her knuckles white, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she believed the carriage would roll into the ditch beside the road, taking her with it into the dark water below. It did not roll. It settled hard on its broken axle, tipped at an angle, and stopped. Elena sat frozen for a few seconds, waiting to see if the danger had truly passed. Only when the driver called out that everyone was safe did she let go of the handle and allow herself to breathe. She stepped down into the mud, her boots sinking, her plain gray traveling dress soaked through in seconds. The rain stung her face. Somewhere behind her, thunder rolled across the hills. She had left the city that morning with nothing but a small trunk, a letter of introduction, and a nervous hope that this new position would finally give her a steady life. She had not expected to be standing in the middle of nowhere, drenched and stranded, with the sky falling apart above her. The driver examined the wheel and shook his head. It would take hours to repair, maybe longer. There was no inn nearby, no town within walking distance before dark. Elena felt panic rising in her chest. She had nowhere to go, no shelter, and the letter in her pocket, now smudged with rain, was the only proof that she was expected somewhere at all. Then she saw the lights. Through the sheets of rain, far up the hill, a great house stood glowing with lantern light in its windows. It looked enormous, more like a small fortress than a home, with high stone walls and dark windows stacked one above the other. Elena had heard of this place before leaving the city. The locals spoke of it in hushed, careful tones. They called it Ashford Hall, and they said its owner was rarely seen, a man who kept to himself and let his household run in near silence. She did not have the luxury of choice. The storm was growing worse, and the carriage could not be fixed before nightfall. She asked the driver to wait as long as he could, gathered her skirts, and began walking up the long gravel road toward the house, her trunk left behind for now, her only protection a thin shawl pulled over her head. By the time she reached the iron gates, she was shivering uncontrollably. She pulled the bell rope with numb fingers and waited, listening to the storm swirl around her, wondering if anyone inside would even hear the bell over the wind. The door opened sooner than she expected. A tall housekeeper with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled into a tight bun looked her over from head to toe, clearly startled by the sight of a soaked stranger standing on the doorstep in the middle of a storm. Elena explained quickly, her teeth chattering, that her carriage had broken down on the road below and that she had nowhere else to go. She held out the smudged letter with a shaking hand. The housekeeper, whose name Elena would soon learn was Margaret, studied the letter for a long moment before her expression softened slightly. She stepped back and allowed Elena inside, out of the rain, into a hall so grand it made Elena forget her wet clothes for a moment. Tall ceilings rose above her, lined with old paintings and candlelight that flickered against dark wood paneling. It was beautiful in a quiet, almost lonely way, as though the house had once been full of laughter and had since grown used to silence. Margaret led her to a smaller sitting room near the kitchens, away from the grand parts of the house, and told her to wait there while dry clothes were found. Elena sat by the fire, grateful for its warmth, and looked around at the room with quiet curiosity. Everything was tidy, almost too tidy, as if no one truly lived here in a relaxed way. It was there, in that small room, that she first heard the light tapping of feet on the floor above, followed by the soft closing of a door. She looked up just as a young woman appeared in the doorway, watching her with wide, curious eyes. The girl looked to be no older than 19, with soft brown hair pinned loosely and a simple pale dress that suggested she belonged to the family rather than the staff. She did not speak. She only stood there, studying Elena carefully, her head tilted slightly to the side. Elena smiled gently and lifted her hand in greeting, expecting the girl to answer with words. Instead, the girl's eyes flicked to Elena's lips, then to her hands, and something in her expression shifted, as if she were waiting for a signal Elena did not yet understand. It was Margaret who returned in that moment, carrying a folded set of dry clothes, who explained quietly that the young woman was named Charlotte, and that Charlotte had been deaf since she was a small child. Margaret's tone was careful, almost protective, the tone of someone used to shielding a person from awkward moments. She said that most people in the house had never learned to speak with their hands, and that Charlotte spent much of her day alone because of it. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, a familiar ache she recognized instantly. She had grown up beside a cousin who lost her hearing after a childhood illness, and in those years, Elena had learned to sign before she had properly learned to write. It had become second nature to her, something she rarely thought about until she needed it. Without stopping to consider what it might mean, Elena set down the dry clothes Margaret had given her, turned toward Charlotte, and lifted her hands. Slowly, clearly, she signed the words "Good morning," followed by a small, warm smile. Charlotte's entire face changed. Her eyes widened, and then, for the first time since Elena had entered the room, she smiled too. A real smile, bright and surprised and full of disbelief. She stepped forward eagerly, her hands moving in quick, excited motions, asking Elena question after question faster than Elena could follow. "Do you know sign? Where did you learn? Are you staying here? Will you visit again?" Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, watching the exchange with an expression Elena could not quite read. It was not suspicion, not exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, as if she had just witnessed something rare and unexpected happen in a house that rarely saw anything unexpected at all. Elena laughed softly and signed back as best she could, slowing her hands so Charlotte could follow, explaining that she had learned as a child, that she was traveling to begin a new position nearby, and that her carriage had broken down in the storm. Charlotte's hands moved rapidly again, this time signing something that made Margaret step forward with visible concern. Charlotte wanted Elena to stay, not just for the night. She wanted her to stay always. Margaret gently interrupted, using slow, careful gestures that were clumsy but familiar to Charlotte, telling her that Elena was only passing through, that she could not simply decide such things on her own. Charlotte's face fell slightly, but she did not argue. Instead, she reached for Elena's hand and held it, as though afraid that letting go would mean losing this rare connection forever. It was in that small, quiet moment, with the storm still raging outside and the fire crackling beside them, that Elena felt something shift inside her chest. She had come to this house purely by accident, forced here by broken wheels and bad weather, expecting to leave again as soon as the roads cleared. But watching Charlotte's face, so full of hope after what must have been months, maybe years, of isolation, Elena felt an unfamiliar pull. A sense that perhaps she had not stumbled onto this house by accident at all. Margaret cleared her throat and suggested, carefully, that perhaps the master of the house might allow Elena to stay the night, given the storm and the state of the roads. She excused herself to send word, leaving Elena alone with Charlotte in the firelit room. Charlotte immediately began signing again, this time slower, patient with Elena's rusty vocabulary, telling her about the house, about her brother who traveled often on estate business, about the quiet days that stretched long and empty when no one bothered to include her. She spoke of a groundskeeper she liked, a stern old cook who slipped her sweets when no one was looking, and a steward who managed the house in her brother's frequent absences, a steward Charlotte described with unusual warmth, calling him quiet, kind, and always watching out for her, even though the other staff often overlooked her presence entirely. Elena listened closely, matching signs and expressions, trying to memorize every detail Charlotte shared, sensing that this friendship, however sudden, mattered deeply to the young woman in front of her. The storm outside grew louder, rattling the windows, but inside that small room, warmed by firelight and unexpected connection, Elena felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt needed. She felt, strangely, as though she had arrived exactly where she was supposed to be, even though nothing about this journey had gone according to plan. Margaret returned a short while later, her expression unreadable once again, informing Elena that she would indeed be permitted to stay the night, and that arrangements were already being made for a proper room. She added, almost as an afterthought, that the steward had personally approved the request and asked that Elena be made comfortable, since the storm showed no sign of easing before morning. Elena thanked her, relieved, and turned back to Charlotte, who was still holding her hand, as though unwilling to release it just yet. The young woman signed one more thing before Margaret led them both toward the guest rooms upstairs, something simple, something Elena would remember clearly for a long time afterward. "Promise you will not disappear like the others." Elena did not fully understand what Charlotte meant by those words, not yet. She only knew, as she followed Margaret up the wide staircase and glanced back once at Charlotte's hopeful face, that something important had already begun the moment she lifted her hands and signed those two simple words. Good morning. 2 words that would end up changing far more than she could have possibly imagined on a stormy night, when her only plan had been to survive until the rain stopped and her journey could continue. Outside, the storm rolled on over the hills, and somewhere within the depths of that quiet, watchful house, a man stood near an upstairs window, unseen, having witnessed the entire exchange between the stranded traveler and his sister. He said nothing to anyone. He simply watched the candlelight flicker in the room below, and for the first time in a very long while, allowed himself the smallest, most careful trace of hope. Elena woke the next morning to sunlight pouring through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered the storm, the broken carriage, the long walk up the hill, and the girl with the wide, hopeful eyes, who had held her hand as though it were a lifeline. She sat up quickly, suddenly worried that the roads had cleared overnight, and that a carriage might already be waiting to take her away before she had the chance to say goodbye properly. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A young maid entered with a tray of tea and bread, informing her that the roads were still too flooded for travel, and that the master of the house had given instructions for her to remain as a guest until it was safe to continue her journey. Elena felt a strange flicker of relief at the news, quickly followed by guilt for feeling relieved at all. She reminded herself that she was expected elsewhere, that a position awaited her in a household she had never seen, and that she could not simply stay in a stranger's home indefinitely because a lonely young woman had asked her to. Still, when she descended the stairs later that morning, freshly dressed in her own clothes now dried and pressed, she found herself hoping to see Charlotte again. She did not have to wait long. Charlotte appeared at the bottom of the staircase almost the moment Elena reached it, practically bouncing with excitement, her hands already moving, before Elena had fully stepped off the last stair. She signed rapid questions, asking if Elena had slept well, if she was hungry, if she would come see the garden, if she would stay another day, another week, forever. Elena laughed and slowed her down gently, signing that she needed food first before she could answer any questions. And Charlotte laughed too, a real, unguarded laugh that seemed to surprise even herself. She grabbed Elena's sleeve and pulled her toward the dining room, chattering with her hands the entire way, describing the garden behind the house, the pond where swans sometimes visited, and a small library her brother rarely used that had, in her opinion, the most wonderful window seat in the entire house. Breakfast passed quickly, filled with easy conversation between them, Elena signing patiently, while Charlotte corrected her clumsy grammar with obvious delight, clearly thrilled to finally have someone who understood her, without effort or hesitation. It was during this meal that Elena noticed how the household staff moved around Charlotte, almost as though she were invisible, speaking over her, past her, never quite to her. No one signed, no one waited for her attention before speaking. It explained everything Charlotte had told her the night before, about feeling forgotten in her own home. After breakfast, Charlotte insisted on showing Elena the garden, and Elena agreed happily, glad for the fresh air after the storm. They walked along neat gravel paths lined with early blooming flowers, Charlotte pointing out details Elena would never have noticed on her own: a bird's nest tucked into a hedge, a stone bench where she liked to sit and watch the clouds, a crooked tree she claimed to have climbed as a child despite her brother's constant worry. It was near the edge of the garden, close to a low stone wall separating the grounds from the surrounding fields, that Elena first properly met the man Charlotte had mentioned the night before. He was tall, dressed simply, in dark, practical clothing that gave no hint of wealth or status. His sleeves rolled to the elbow, as though he had been doing physical work. His dark hair was slightly windswept, and his expression, when he noticed them approaching, shifted from quiet concentration to something gentler, almost relieved, the moment his eyes landed on Charlotte. Charlotte released Elena's arm and rushed toward him, signing quickly, clearly telling him about her new friend with obvious excitement. The man watched her hands carefully, nodding along, occasionally glancing toward Elena with an expression she could not quite place. When Charlotte finished, he turned to Elena and offered a polite, measured bow. He introduced himself as William, the steward of the estate, responsible for managing the household and grounds in the master's frequent absence. His voice was calm and steady, carrying a quiet authority that seemed at odds with his plain clothing. He thanked Elena for her kindness toward Charlotte, saying that it had been a long time since he had seen her this happy, this animated, this much like herself. Elena, charmed despite herself by his sincerity, admitted that she had simply reacted without thinking, that seeing Charlotte's isolation had reminded her of her own cousin's experience growing up, and that she could not have walked away without at least trying to communicate properly. William studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression crossing his face, before he thanked her again, more quietly this time, and turned his attention back to Charlotte, checking with careful, deliberate signs that she had eaten breakfast and rested well after the excitement of the previous night. Elena watched the exchange with quiet surprise. He knew basic signs, simple ones, clearly learned out of necessity rather than fluency, but his effort was evident, his patience obvious. It was clear he cared for Charlotte deeply, even if he could not communicate with her the way Elena could. Over the following hours, as the day stretched on and the storm clouds finally cleared from the sky, Elena found herself falling into an easy rhythm within the household. She helped Charlotte with small tasks, translated between her and the staff when necessary, and found herself, more than once, exchanging brief conversations with William as he moved about the estate handling various responsibilities. He was quiet by nature, she noticed, careful with his words, never boastful, never dismissive. He asked her questions about her background, her family, the position awaiting her elsewhere, and listened intently to her answers, as though genuinely interested, rather than simply making polite conversation. In turn, Elena asked about the household, about Charlotte's history, about the mysterious master of the house, who seemed to exist more as a rumor among the staff than an actual presence. William's answers about his employer were careful, almost evasive, describing him only in vague terms. Distant, busy, occupied with matters beyond the estate, Elena, sensing a strange discomfort whenever the topic arose, found herself teasing him gently about it, joking that surely even a busy nobleman could spare a little time for his own sister, who clearly needed him more than any business matter possibly could. William's expression flickered at that comment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, but he said nothing to correct her, only offering a small, tight smile before changing the subject. By evening, the estate's carriage had been sent to retrieve Elena's trunk from the broken coach below, and word arrived that the roads would likely be clear enough for safe travel by the following afternoon. Elena felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at the news, quickly followed by confusion at her own reaction. She reminded herself firmly that she had a position waiting, a life to build, obligations she could not abandon simply because a storm had briefly interrupted her plans. That evening, after supper, Charlotte found her once again in the small sitting room near the kitchens, this time carrying a worn wooden box filled with old drawings and letters. She showed Elena picture after picture, explaining each one with careful, patient signs, memories from her childhood before illness had taken her hearing, memories of a mother who had died when she was young, and a brother who had raised her afterward despite being barely more than a boy himself at the time. Elena listened, moved deeply by the story, understanding now why the household staff protected Charlotte so carefully, and why the mysterious master of the house remained such an enigma, someone who had clearly sacrificed much of his own youth to raise a sister alone. It was during this quiet exchange that William appeared in the doorway, watching them for a long moment before Charlotte noticed him and waved him over eagerly, wanting to share her old drawings with him as well. He sat down beside them without hesitation, examining each drawing carefully, occasionally signing small comments to Charlotte that made her smile. Elena found herself studying him during this exchange, noticing small details she had missed before. The careful way he handled the old drawings, as though they were precious beyond their simple paper and ink. The gentle patience in his expression whenever Charlotte struggled to explain something complicated through simple gestures. The quiet sadness that occasionally crossed his face when Charlotte mentioned their mother. When Charlotte eventually grew tired and retired for the evening, Elena remained in the sitting room, unwilling yet to end the day, and William lingered as well, seemingly equally reluctant to part ways just yet. They talked for a long while after that, conversation flowing more easily than Elena had expected, given how little time they had actually known each other. William asked about her cousin, the one who had taught her to sign, and Elena spoke fondly of childhood summers spent learning an entirely new language, just so she could share stories and secrets with someone she loved. In turn, William spoke, carefully and slowly, about his own childhood, though he remained vague about specific details, mentioning responsibilities that came too early, an absence that grew unbearably heavy at times, and a fierce, protective love for his sister that had shaped nearly every decision he had made since becoming responsible for her. Elena, listening closely, felt something warm settle in her chest, an easy comfort she had not expected to find in a stranger's home during an unplanned, storm-forced visit. She found herself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that circumstances might somehow allow her to stay a little longer, to know this quiet, thoughtful man better, to watch Charlotte's confidence continue blooming under the attention she so clearly deserved. Before retiring for the night, Elena mentioned again, almost as a joke, that the mysterious Duke of this household must be quite an unusual man, absent so often that his own household staff seemed more familiar with rumors about him than actual memories. She wondered aloud, teasingly, whether he even knew how wonderful his own sister truly was, given how rarely he seemed to be present to witness it. William's expression grew complicated again at her words, something between amusement and quiet pain, before he simply replied that the Duke was, in his experience, a man who often struggled to know his own worth, let alone appreciate the people fortunate enough to be close to him. Elena laughed softly at what she assumed was simple loyalty toward a difficult employer, unaware of the deeper truth hidden behind his careful words. She said goodnight, retired to her room, and lay awake for a long while afterward, thinking not of the unfamiliar Duke she had never met, but of the quiet steward whose company she had unexpectedly come to enjoy, far more than she had anticipated when she first stumbled, soaked and desperate, onto the doorstep of Ashford Hall. Outside her window, the stars finally emerged from behind the clearing storm clouds, scattering soft light across the quiet estate below, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what tomorrow might bring. The carriage that arrived the next morning to collect Elena's trunk sat waiting in the courtyard far longer than expected, because Elena herself could not seem to make herself climb inside it. She stood near the front steps of Ashford Hall, her small bag in hand, watching Charlotte's face fall with each passing minute as the moment of departure grew closer. It was Margaret, of all people, who finally spoke up, suggesting quietly that perhaps a short delay would not cause too much trouble, especially since the roads, though passable, were still soft and uneven from the storm. She mentioned, almost casually, that the household could certainly use an extra pair of hands for a few days, someone patient enough to help Charlotte catch up on her lessons, which had fallen badly behind due to the lack of anyone who could properly communicate with her. Elena hesitated only a moment before agreeing, telling herself firmly that this was simply a practical decision, a kindness extended to a young woman who needed help, nothing more. She sent word ahead to her new employer, explaining the delay, praying they would understand, and turned back toward the house feeling lighter than she had any right to feel over such a small, sensible decision. The following days settled into an easy, comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with lessons in the small library Charlotte had mentioned earlier, the one with the wonderful window seat, where sunlight spilled across old books and dust motes floated lazily in the warm air. Elena taught Charlotte new vocabulary and sign, patiently building on what she already knew, while Charlotte, in turn, taught Elena small details about running such a large household, details she had absorbed simply from years of watching, even if no one had ever properly consulted her on such matters. Afternoons often found them in the garden, sometimes joined by William, who seemed to find increasingly frequent reasons to be nearby whenever Elena and Charlotte were together. He would appear near the rose beds pretending to inspect the gardening work, or linger by the stables under the excuse of checking on a horse that clearly needed no additional attention. Elena noticed his transparent excuses and found herself smiling more often than she probably should have, secretly pleased each time he found a reason to join them. One afternoon, while Charlotte napped after an exhausting morning of lessons, Elena found herself walking alone through the estate's expansive grounds, eventually wandering near the stables, where she discovered William working quietly beside one of the horses, murmuring softly to the animal as he checked its leg for an injury the groundskeeper had mentioned earlier. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her, unwilling to interrupt the gentle, careful way he handled the nervous animal. When he finally looked up and saw her, he offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes in a way she was beginning to recognize as rare and precious. They fell into easy conversation as he continued his work, Elena asking about the horse, about the estate, about his responsibilities as steward. William answered readily, describing the day-to-day operations of managing such a large property, the tenant farmers who relied on fair treatment, the seasonal repairs that never seemed to end, the constant balancing of accounts and correspondence that came with overseeing so much land and so many people depending on it functioning properly. Elena listened, genuinely impressed by the depth of his knowledge and the obvious care he took in his responsibilities. She commented, half teasing, that he seemed to carry more weight on his shoulders than most stewards she had heard of, managing an estate this size with such attention to every small detail. William's hands paused briefly on the horse's leg before he continued, explaining quietly that he had essentially run the estate since he was young, long before officially holding any formal title, out of necessity rather than choice. He said it without self-pity, simply stating a fact of his life, but Elena caught the weight behind his words, sensing there was far more to his story than he was currently willing to share. She did not press him further, respecting the boundary he had quietly drawn, but she found herself even more curious about the man standing before her, a man who spoke of duty and responsibility, with the weariness of someone who had carried burdens far beyond his years. Later that same day, Elena finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since her first morning at Ashford Hall. She asked William directly whether the Duke, this endlessly absent master of the house, had any idea how much responsibility rested on the shoulders of his steward, and whether he appreciated the sacrifices being made in his name while he remained elsewhere, seemingly indifferent to his own household's needs. William was quiet for a long moment before answering, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the stable yard. He said, slowly and carefully, that the Duke understood far more than people assumed, that his absences were not born from indifference, but from complicated circumstances that were difficult to explain, and that the weight he carried was not something he chose to avoid, but something that had become tangled with fear over time. Elena, misunderstanding the depth of his answer, laughed softly, and said that fear seemed like a poor excuse for neglecting a sister as wonderful as Charlotte, especially when that sister so clearly craved his presence and attention. She added, without thinking, that if she ever met this Duke in person, she would have quite a lot to say to him about priorities and responsibility. William's expression shifted subtly at her words, something between amusement and quiet discomfort crossing his features, but he said nothing to defend himself, only offering a small nod before changing the subject entirely, asking instead about her own family and the position that still awaited her elsewhere. That evening, after supper, Charlotte insisted on organizing a small gathering in the sitting room, delighted by the prospect of spending time with both Elena and William together. She brought out an old set of cards, teaching Elena a simple game she had learned as a child, laughing freely whenever Elena lost a round, her joy infectious enough to draw genuine laughter from William as well, something Elena suspected was rare enough to be noticed by the household staff passing by the doorway. As the evening wore on, and Charlotte eventually grew tired, retiring early, with a satisfied yawn, Elena and William found themselves once again alone in comfortable silence, the fire crackling gently beside them. William spoke more openly that night than he had before, sharing small memories of his childhood, careful still to avoid specific details, but revealing enough that Elena began piecing together a picture of a young boy forced into adulthood far too soon, burdened with responsibilities that should never have fallen on shoulders so young. She found herself sharing her own story in turn, speaking of her parents' modest circumstances, her decision to seek employment as a governess to support herself, and her quiet fear that she might never find a place where she truly belonged, always moving from one household to another, never quite settling anywhere long enough to call it home. William listened intently, his expression softening with each word, and when she finished, he said quietly that perhaps circumstances existed for a reason, that sometimes the places we least expect to matter end up shaping our lives more deeply than we could have anticipated. Elena felt her cheeks warm at the sincerity in his voice, uncertain how to respond, but before she could find the words, a sudden knock interrupted the moment, and one of the household maids appeared in the doorway, her expression flustered and apologetic. The maid addressed William directly, using a formal title that made Elena's brow furrow slightly in confusion. before quickly correcting herself and referring to him simply as Sir, explaining that an urgent letter had arrived requiring his immediate attention. William rose quickly, his expression tightening, with something Elena could not quite place, thanked the maid, and excused himself hastily, leaving Elena alone with her confusion. She sat by the dying fire for a long while afterward, turning the strange moment over in her mind. Surely she had misheard the maid's initial words. Surely a simple steward would not be addressed with such formality, even by mistake. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps a slip of the tongue born from habit or exhaustion, and eventually made her way to bed, pushing the odd moment from her thoughts. The following morning brought new distractions, as Charlotte woke eager and excited, eager to show Elena a hidden section of the garden she had apparently forgotten to mention before, a small overgrown area near the old orchard that had once been her mother's favorite place to sit and read. They spent the morning there together, Elena helping Charlotte clear away weeds and overgrown vines from a small stone bench, uncovering an old inscription carved into its surface that brought unexpected tears to Charlotte's eyes. It was a simple phrase, weathered by years of exposure but still legible, dedicated to a mother whose love and warmth apparently still echoed through every corner of the estate, even years after her passing. Charlotte signed slowly, her hands trembling slightly, that her brother had commissioned this bench shortly after their mother's death, spending hours here alone, before Charlotte's illness had taken her hearing, and made such quiet, reflective visits impossible for her to properly share alongside him. Elena felt her heart ache at the image Charlotte painted, a young boy, grieving alone in a garden, carrying the weight of his family's loss, long before he was old enough to fully understand it. She found herself wondering, with growing frequency, about this absent duke, this mysterious figure whose presence seemed to shape every corner of the estate, despite his physical absence from it. That afternoon, while walking back toward the main house, Elena encountered William once again, his expression still slightly strained from whatever news the urgent letter had apparently contained the previous night. She asked gently if everything was all right, and he assured her quickly that it was simply estate business, nothing worth concerning herself over. Sensing his reluctance to discuss it further, Elena changed the subject, mentioning instead the hidden garden Charlotte had shown her that morning, the old stone bench, the inscription dedicated to their mother. William's expression grew visibly softer at the mention, and he admitted quietly that he had not visited that particular spot in quite some time, finding it difficult, even after all these years, to sit there without feeling the full weight of everything that had changed since his mother's passing. Elena, moved by his honesty, reached out instinctively and placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering silent comfort without needing words to express it. William looked down at her hand, then up at her face, something unspoken passing between them in that quiet moment, something neither of them seemed quite ready to name yet. He thanked her softly for her kindness, both toward himself and toward Charlotte, admitting that her presence over these past few days had brought more light into the household than he had witnessed in a very long time. Elena, flustered by the sincerity in his words, admitted in turn that she had not expected to feel so at home in a place she had only stumbled upon by accident during a storm. They stood there together for a long moment, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, neither quite willing to break the fragile, comfortable silence that had settled between them. Eventually, duty called them both away, William toward his endless estate responsibilities, Elena back toward Charlotte and the lessons still waiting to be completed. But the moment lingered in both their minds, long after they parted ways, a quiet acknowledgement of something growing steadily between them, something neither fully understood yet, but something neither seemed inclined to resist. A week passed, then another, and Elena found every reasonable excuse to extend her stay at Ashford Hall, each excuse growing thinner and less convincing even to herself. Charlotte's lessons had long since caught up to where they needed to be, and yet Elena remained, telling herself it was only fair to see the young woman fully settled before departing for her true position elsewhere. The truth, which she barely admitted even in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that she had grown deeply attached to this strange, quiet household, to Charlotte's infectious warmth, and increasingly, to William himself. Their conversations had grown longer, more personal, stretching late into the evenings after Charlotte retired for the night. William spoke more freely now, sharing stories of his childhood that painted a clearer picture of a boy forced to grow up too quickly, though he remained frustratingly vague about certain details, particularly anything relating directly to his employer, The elusive Duke. Elena had stopped questioning this vagueness as strange. She assumed it was simply professional discretion, a steward's natural reluctance to gossip about the family he served. Instead, she focused on the parts of William he willingly shared, his dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly during quiet moments, his fierce protectiveness over Charlotte, his surprising knowledge of poetry that he admitted, almost sheepishly, he had taught himself from his mother's old collection of books. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping through the estate grounds, carrying the first hints of colder weather, Elena and William found themselves walking together along the garden paths after supper, Charlotte having retired early with a slight headache. The conversation drifted naturally from estate matters to more personal topics, eventually settling on the subject of the future, a topic Elena had been carefully avoiding since her extended stay had begun. William asked, carefully, whether she still intended to leave for her original position once matters at Ashford Hall were fully settled. Elena hesitated before answering honestly that she was no longer certain, that the longer she remained, the harder it became to imagine leaving, though she recognized how impractical such feelings were given her circumstances. William stopped walking entirely at her words, turning to face her fully, his expression unusually open and vulnerable in the fading evening light. He admitted, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, that he had been dreading the day she would finally leave, that her presence had changed something in the household, in Charlotte, and in himself, that he was not entirely certain he knew how to properly put into words. Elena's breath caught at his admission, her heart racing as she searched his face for confirmation of what she suspected he was truly trying to say. Before either of them could find the courage to speak further, however, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them, and one of the younger stable boys came rushing up the garden path, breathless and clearly searching for William urgently. The boy explained quickly that a group of visitors had arrived unexpectedly at the main gate, distant relatives of the family, apparently unaware that the master of the house was not currently receiving guests. William's expression shifted immediately into careful professionalism, and he excused himself hastily, promising Elena they would continue their conversation soon, though the urgency in his departure left Elena standing alone in the garden, her mind racing with unanswered questions and unspoken feelings. She waited nearly an hour before curiosity finally overcame her patience, and she made her way quietly toward the main hall, intending simply to see if the unexpected guests required any assistance from the household staff, given her own extended presence within the family's daily routines. What she found instead left her frozen in the shadowed hallway just outside the main sitting room. Through the partially open door, she could see William standing near the fireplace, engaged in formal conversation with an older woman, dressed in expensive traveling clothes, and an equally well-dressed younger man, who bore a striking resemblance to Charlotte around the eyes. The older woman addressed William with unmistakable familiarity, calling him by a name Elena had never heard used in reference to him before. She called him, Your Grace. Elena's heart stumbled painfully in her chest, her mind immediately rejecting what she had just heard, searching desperately for some alternate explanation that would make sense of the impossible words. Perhaps it was a joke. Perhaps the woman had simply misspoken, confused by unfamiliar surroundings after a long journey. But then the younger man spoke as well, addressing William with the same formal title, discussing matters of estate management and family obligations with the easy familiarity of someone speaking to an equal, not a hired steward managing another man's affairs. Elena remained frozen in the hallway, unable to move, unable to fully process what she was witnessing. Every conversation she had shared with William over the past several weeks suddenly rearranged itself in her mind. Every vague answer about the Duke, every uncomfortable pause whenever she had criticized the absent master of the house directly to his face, every strange formality from the staff that she had previously dismissed as simple slips of the tongue. He was not the steward. He had never been the steward. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs entirely. She thought back to every teasing comment she had made about the neglectful Duke, every complaint about his absence, every joke about what she would say to him if given the chance, all of it spoken directly to the man himself, who had listened silently, allowing her to believe an elaborate lie without correction. Humiliation flooded through her, hot and overwhelming, quickly followed by a sharper, more painful emotion she could not immediately name. Betrayal, perhaps. Confusion. A desperate need to understand why he had allowed the deception to continue for so long. Why he had let her believe something so fundamentally untrue about who he truly was. She backed away slowly from the doorway, careful not to make a sound, her mind racing frantically as she retreated toward the quiet safety of her guest room. Once inside, she closed the door firmly behind her and sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as the full weight of the discovery settled over her. Every moment they had shared together suddenly felt tainted by uncertainty. Had his kindness been genuine, or simply the amused indulgence of a powerful man entertaining himself with a naive traveler who had no idea who she was truly speaking with? Had his careful attention toward Charlotte's happiness been real, or had Elena simply been a convenient tool used to manage his sister's isolation without requiring his own personal involvement? She thought of the quiet moment in the garden, his hand beneath hers, the vulnerability in his voice as he admitted dread over her eventual departure. Had any of it been real, or had she simply been performing for an audience of one, an audience who held far more power over her circumstances than she had ever realized? A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and she quickly composed herself before answering, opening the door to find William standing there, his expression carrying an unfamiliar heaviness she had not seen from him before. He asked quietly if he could come inside to speak with her, his eyes searching her face carefully, as though sensing that something had shifted between them since their earlier conversation in the garden. Elena hesitated, torn between the anger and hurt currently churning inside her chest, and the deep, undeniable pull she still felt toward this man, regardless of the deception he had maintained. She stepped aside silently, allowing him entry, closing the door behind them both. William began speaking immediately, his words rushed and uncharacteristically nervous, explaining that the relatives who had arrived unexpectedly were distant cousins he rarely tolerated, that their visit had nothing to do with anything Elena needed to worry about. He seemed for a moment entirely unaware that Elena had discovered anything unusual at all, continuing to speak as though their earlier interrupted conversation could simply resume where it had left off. Elena interrupted him quietly, her voice steadier than she felt internally, asking simply why the visiting relatives had addressed him as Your Grace. The color drained visibly from William's face at her question, his earlier nervous energy replaced instantly by a heavy, guilty stillness. He remained silent for a long moment, clearly searching for words that would somehow soften the impact of what he needed to admit, before finally, quietly, confirming what Elena had already suspected but desperately hoped might somehow prove untrue. He was not the steward of Ashford Hall. He was the Duke. He had been the Duke from the very first moment they met, standing near the garden wall that first afternoon, allowing her to believe he was merely a household employee, because, in that moment, it had felt easier, safer, more honest, in its own strange way, than revealing his true identity immediately. Elena felt something inside her chest crack painfully at his confession, the full weight of every conversation they had shared crashing down around her with new, uncomfortable meaning. She asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed, why he had allowed the deception to continue for so long, why he had not simply corrected her the very first time she had mistakenly assumed his identity. William's expression grew pained, his own voice unsteady as he attempted to explain. He said that in his experience, people treated him differently the moment they learned his title, growing formal, cautious, calculating in their words and actions, always aware of what his position might offer them. He said that watching Elena interact so freely and genuinely with Charlotte, treating him with the same easy honesty rather than careful deference, had felt like the first truly genuine connection he had experienced in longer than he cared to admit. He admitted that he had intended to correct the misunderstanding early on, but each day that passed made the truth feel more difficult to reveal, fearing that the moment she learned who he truly was, the warmth and honesty between them would disappear, replaced by the same careful distance he had grown used to experiencing from everyone else in his life. Elena listened to his explanation, understanding the logic behind it even as hurt continued to churn painfully within her chest. She reminded him, her voice sharper now, of every teasing comment she had made about the neglectful Duke, every criticism spoken directly to his face, while believing herself to be speaking with someone else entirely, someone equal to herself, rather than a man holding significant power over her circumstances. William did not attempt to defend himself against her accusations, accepting each one with quiet, visible guilt. He said simply that her honesty, even when it had stung, had been the most valuable gift anyone had offered him in years, and that he deeply regretted allowing his own fear to cause her this pain now. Elena remained silent for a long moment, torn between the anger still burning within her and the undeniable sincerity evident in his expression. She finally asked, quietly, what he expected to happen now that the truth had finally emerged between them. William hesitated before answering honestly that he did not know, that he only hoped she might eventually find it within herself to forgive the deception, understanding that it had never been born from cruelty or manipulation, but from a desperate, perhaps foolish hope of experiencing genuine connection, before the weight of his title inevitably changed everything between them. Elena did not respond immediately, her emotions too tangled and overwhelming to form a coherent answer. Instead, she asked quietly for time alone, to process everything she had just learned, and William, understanding immediately, nodded and excused himself without further argument, leaving her alone once again, with her racing thoughts and uncertain heart. Outside her window, evening had fully settled over the estate, stars beginning to emerge across the darkening sky, indifferent to the quiet turmoil unfolding within the walls below, where a young woman sat wrestling with betrayal and affection in equal measure, uncertain which emotion would ultimately win out as the night stretched on before her. Sleep did not come easily that night, and Elena rose before dawn, her eyes heavy and her heart still tangled in confusion. She dressed quietly, deciding that regardless of the emotional storm still raging inside her, she needed fresh air to think clearly. She slipped out of the house before the household staff had fully begun their morning duties, walking briskly toward the quiet edge of the garden, where she had first properly spoken with William weeks earlier. She had not expected to encounter anyone else at such an early hour, which made the sight of the visiting cousin, the well-dressed young man from the previous evening, startling as he emerged from behind a tall hedge, apparently taking his own early morning walk through the grounds. He introduced himself politely as Edmund Ashford, a distant cousin of the family, and immediately expressed surprise at finding a stranger wandering the estate so early. Elena explained briefly that she was assisting Charlotte with her lessons, careful to keep her explanations simple and professional, despite the turmoil still churning within her. Edmund's expression shifted subtly at the mention of Charlotte, something calculating flickering briefly across his otherwise pleasant features, before he smoothed it away with practiced ease. He mentioned, almost casually, that it was fortunate someone competent had finally taken an interest in Charlotte's education, adding that the current arrangement, with the Duke so frequently absent from proper estate matters, left much to be desired in terms of managing the family's affairs efficiently. Elena, sensing something uncomfortable beneath his polite words, asked carefully what he meant by his comment. Edmund explained, with a tone of practiced concern that felt slightly rehearsed, that certain family members had grown worried about Charlotte's welfare given her brother's frequent distraction with estate business, wondering whether alternative arrangements might better serve her long-term needs, particularly given her unfortunate condition. Elena bristled immediately at his choice of words, quickly correcting him that Charlotte's deafness was not a condition requiring pity or alternative arrangements, but simply a difference that required proper communication and patience, qualities she had witnessed abundantly from both Charlotte's brother and the dedicated household staff surrounding her. Edmund's smile tightened slightly at her correction, though he recovered quickly, complimenting Elena on her evident dedication to Charlotte's welfare, before excusing himself politely, mentioning an appointment with his mother regarding family matters that required his attention. Elena watched him walk away, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with her earlier turmoil regarding William's true identity. She returned to the house troubled by the encounter, deciding to mention it to William at the earliest opportunity, regardless of the awkwardness still lingering between them following the previous night's revelation. She found him in his study shortly after breakfast, reviewing documents with a tired, distracted expression that suggested he had slept even less than she had. He looked up quickly when she entered, his expression shifting immediately into cautious hope, clearly uncertain what to expect from her after their difficult conversation the previous evening. Elena, setting aside her own unresolved feelings for the moment, quickly relayed her uncomfortable encounter with Edmund, describing his troubling comments about alternative arrangements for Charlotte's welfare. William's expression darkened considerably as she spoke, his jaw tightening with obvious tension. He explained, his voice carefully controlled despite evident anger, that Edmund and his mother had long harbored ambitions regarding the family estate, believing themselves better suited to manage Charlotte's affairs and, by extension, gain significant influence over the family's considerable wealth and property. He revealed that Edmund's mother, his own aunt through a distant family connection, had attempted on more than one occasion to have Charlotte's guardianship legally challenged, arguing that her deafness made her incapable of properly managing her own affairs once she reached adulthood, and that William himself, given his frequent need to balance estate responsibilities with caring for his sister, was insufficiently equipped to serve as her sole guardian. Elena felt a fresh wave of anger rise within her at this revelation, outraged on Charlotte's behalf at the idea of anyone attempting to exploit her condition for personal gain. She asked William directly what he intended to do about the renewed threat, given the family's unexpected and clearly calculated visit. William admitted, his expression grim, that he had hoped this particular battle was long settled, having successfully defended Charlotte's guardianship legally several years earlier. However, Edmund's unexpected visit, combined with his mother's continued involvement, suggested they intended to renew their efforts, likely believing that recent changes within the household, meaning Elena's own extended presence, might somehow be used against him, perhaps painting an unconventional picture of impropriety or instability within the estate's management. Elena's stomach dropped uncomfortably at this suggestion, immediately understanding the danger her own presence might now represent to the situation. If William's relatives intended to use any excuse possible to challenge his guardianship over Charlotte, her own extended stay, however innocent, could easily be twisted into evidence of impropriety, potentially damaging not only William's reputation, but Charlotte's future security as well. She voiced this concern immediately, suggesting perhaps it would be wisest for her to leave promptly, removing any potential ammunition the scheming relatives might use against the family. William's expression grew pained at her suggestion, clearly torn between protecting his sister's interests and his own evident reluctance to see Elena depart so abruptly, especially given the unresolved tension still lingering between them following his earlier confession. Before either of them could reach a decision, however, a sharp knock interrupted their conversation, and Margaret entered hurriedly, her expression tense with obvious concern. She explained quickly that Charlotte had gone missing from her room, and that a thorough search of the immediate household had turned up no sign of her anywhere. Panic flooded through Elena immediately, and William rose so quickly from his desk that his chair toppled backward with a loud crash. He demanded details from Margaret, learning that Charlotte had last been seen shortly after breakfast, retreating to her room claiming a headache, similar to the previous evening, but that a maid checking on her later had found the room entirely empty, with no indication of where she might have gone. Elena's mind raced immediately toward the hidden garden, the overgrown area near the old orchard where Charlotte's mother's memorial bench remained tucked away, wondering if perhaps Charlotte had simply sought quiet solitude there, understandably overwhelmed by the tension surrounding the unexpected family visit and the emotional weight of recent days. She voiced this possibility to William, who immediately agreed it was worth investigating, and together they hurried from the study, moving quickly through the house and out into the gardens, their earlier awkwardness momentarily forgotten in shared concern for Charlotte's safety. The hidden garden, however, proved empty upon their arrival, the old stone bench sitting undisturbed beneath the overgrown branches, no sign anywhere of Charlotte's presence. Elena felt her earlier panic deepen considerably, exchanging a worried glance with William as they quickly began searching other familiar areas of the estate, the stables, the small library with its beloved window seat, even the kitchen gardens where Charlotte sometimes enjoyed helping the cook gather fresh herbs. Each location proved similarly empty, and as the search stretched onward with growing desperation, Elena's mind began conjuring increasingly worrying possibilities. Had Charlotte overheard something regarding the family's renewed threat to challenge her guardianship? Had she grown frightened, perhaps believing herself a burden to her brother given the ongoing family disputes surrounding her care? It was nearly an hour into their frantic search, as afternoon shadows began stretching longer across the estate grounds, that Elena suddenly remembered something Charlotte had mentioned weeks earlier during one of their early lessons together. A small detail about a hidden path near the eastern edge of the property leading toward a cliff overlooking the sea, a place Charlotte had described as beautiful but dangerous, somewhere her brother had strictly forbidden her from visiting alone, due to the unstable, crumbling edges along the cliffside. Elena's blood ran cold at the memory, immediately voicing her concern to William, who paled visibly at the suggestion. Without further discussion, they both broke into a run, heading urgently toward the estate's eastern boundary, praying desperately that their fear proved unfounded, that Charlotte had simply chosen somewhere far safer to process her overwhelming emotions. The path toward the eastern cliffs proved harder to follow than Elena had anticipated, overgrown with wild grass and narrow enough in places that they were forced to move single file, William leading the way with long, urgent strides while Elena struggled to keep pace behind him, her heart pounding with fear for Charlotte's safety. The sound of crashing waves grew louder as they approached, and soon the narrow path opened onto a wide, grassy clearing, perched dangerously close to the crumbling cliff edge, the sea stretching out endlessly below, its surface catching the pale afternoon light in scattered, glittering patterns. Elena spotted Charlotte first, standing dangerously close to the unstable edge, her back turned toward them, her shoulders shaking with what could only be quiet, desperate sobs. William called out immediately, though Elena quickly reminded him, breathless from their hurried journey, that Charlotte would not hear his voice, that they needed to approach carefully rather than risk startling her with sudden movement so close to such treacherous ground. They moved forward slowly, cautiously, until they were close enough for Charlotte to notice their presence through peripheral vision. She turned quickly, her face streaked with tears, visibly startled by their sudden appearance. William immediately signed for her to step back from the edge, his hands shaking slightly with barely controlled fear, but Charlotte, overwhelmed by emotion, seemed frozen in place, her feet dangerously close to where the ground began crumbling away toward the rocks and waves far below. Elena stepped forward carefully, positioning herself where Charlotte could clearly see her hands, signing slowly and gently that she loved her, that she was safe, that whatever had frightened her could be discussed calmly once she moved to safer ground. Charlotte's eyes filled with fresh tears as she watched Elena's careful, patient signs, and slowly, hesitantly, she took a small step backward, away from the crumbling edge. William closed the remaining distance quickly, the moment Charlotte was safely clear of danger, pulling his sister into a tight, protective embrace, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief. Charlotte clung to him tightly for a long moment before pulling back enough to sign frantically, her hands moving faster than Elena could easily follow, clearly overwhelmed with emotion she desperately needed to express. Elena moved closer, translating quietly for William as Charlotte explained, through tears and rapid, urgent signing, that she had overheard part of the earlier conversation between William and Elena in the study, catching enough fragments to understand that Edmund and his mother intended to challenge her guardianship once again, painting her as incapable of managing her own life, simply because she could not hear. She signed desperately that she felt like a burden, that her deafness had always made her different, difficult, something requiring constant management and protection, rather than someone capable of living a full, independent life. She confessed that in a moment of overwhelming despair, she had wandered toward the cliffs without any real plan, simply needing to escape the suffocating feeling of being discussed and managed like a problem, rather than treated like a person with her own thoughts and desires. William's expression crumbled with visible pain as Elena translated Charlotte's words, immediately signing back with desperate sincerity that she was never a burden, that her deafness had never once made him love her any less, or see her as anything other than capable and worthy of a full, independent future. He explained that his frustration had always been directed entirely at Edmund and his mother's cruel manipulation of her condition for their own selfish gain, never at Charlotte herself. Elena, watching this raw, emotional exchange between siblings, felt her own eyes filling with tears, moved deeply by the fierce love evident between them, despite the complicated circumstances surrounding their family. She gently added her own reassurance, signing to Charlotte that her ability to communicate, to learn, to connect deeply with others, had nothing whatsoever to do with her hearing, and everything to do with her own remarkable spirit and intelligence. Charlotte, comforted by their combined reassurance, finally allowed herself to be led safely away from the dangerous cliff edge, the three of them walking slowly back toward the main house as the afternoon sun began its gradual descent toward evening. William kept a protective arm around his sister's shoulders the entire walk back, occasionally glancing toward Elena with an expression of profound gratitude that needed no words to convey its depth. Once safely back within the house, Charlotte was settled comfortably in her room, exhausted both physically and emotionally from the day's events, while William and Elena remained downstairs, finally finding a quiet moment alone in the aftermath of the frightening ordeal. William spoke first, his voice thick with emotion, thanking Elena for her quick thinking, her patience, and her unwavering care for his sister throughout the entire terrifying search. He admitted that he could not imagine how differently the day might have ended without her steady presence guiding them toward safety. Elena, still shaken from the day's events, admitted honestly that her fear for Charlotte's safety had temporarily overshadowed her own lingering hurt regarding his earlier deception, though she acknowledged that the underlying issue between them still remained unresolved. She said quietly that today's events had reminded her of what truly mattered: family, safety, genuine connection, but that trust, once shaken, could not simply be restored through a single frightening incident alone. William nodded solemnly, accepting her honesty without argument, before revealing something further that had been weighing on his mind throughout their earlier search. He explained that Edmund's renewed threat toward Charlotte's guardianship was likely to intensify now, especially if word reached them regarding today's dangerous incident near the cliffs, which could easily be twisted and exaggerated to suggest Charlotte was unstable or improperly supervised within the household. Elena's stomach twisted uncomfortably at this realization, understanding immediately the delicate, precarious position the family now found themselves in. She asked carefully what legal protections currently existed to prevent Edmund and his mother from successfully challenging the guardianship arrangement. William explained, his expression heavy with exhaustion, that while his legal standing as Charlotte's guardian remained solid under normal circumstances, any suggestion of instability or impropriety within the household could potentially be used to argue that Charlotte's environment was unsafe, opening dangerous legal avenues that Edmund's family had clearly been searching for an opportunity to exploit. He admitted, with visible reluctance, that Elena's own extended presence within the household, however innocent and beneficial it had proven to be, might unfortunately provide exactly the kind of ambiguous circumstance Edmund's family could twist into damaging accusations, particularly if combined with rumors of today's frightening incident near the cliffs. Elena felt a heavy weight settle over her chest at this realization, understanding immediately what William was carefully, painfully suggesting without directly stating it. Perhaps, for Charlotte's own protection and future security, it would be wisest for Elena to finally continue on toward her original position, removing any potential complications her continued presence might introduce into an already precarious legal situation. The thought of leaving now, after everything they had experienced together, after finally understanding the true weight of William's identity and the complicated circumstances surrounding his family, felt almost unbearably painful. Yet Elena also understood, with painful clarity, that Charlotte's safety and future security mattered infinitely more than her own personal feelings, regardless of how deeply those feelings had grown over the past several weeks. She told William quietly that she understood the difficult position they now found themselves in, and that she would need time to consider the best path forward, both for Charlotte's sake and for her own uncertain future. William nodded, clearly torn between relief at her understanding and evident heartbreak at the prospect of her potential departure, before excusing himself to check on Charlotte once more before the household finally settled for the evening. Elena remained alone in the quiet sitting room for a long while afterward, staring into the dying embers of the fire, her mind consumed with impossible choices. Love and duty seemed to be pulling her in entirely opposite directions, and she had no clear sense yet of which path she would ultimately be forced to choose, or whether choosing either would leave her heart intact by morning. Elena barely slept that night, her mind turning over every possible outcome until exhaustion finally overtook her sometime before dawn. She woke to the sound of raised voices echoing faintly through the house, sharp and tense in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. Dressing quickly, she made her way toward the main hall, where the voices grew steadily louder and more distinct. Edmund's mother, a stern-faced woman named Lady Bramwell, stood in the entrance hall, her voice cold and commanding, as she addressed William directly, her son standing slightly behind her, with an expression of carefully concealed satisfaction. She announced, without any pretense of polite conversation, that she had already sent word to the family's solicitor regarding yesterday's dangerous incident near the eastern cliffs, insisting that such a clear demonstration of inadequate supervision left her no choice but to formally pursue legal action regarding Charlotte's guardianship. William's expression remained carefully controlled, though Elena could see the tension radiating from his rigid posture as he calmly countered that Charlotte's safety had never once been genuinely at risk, that both he and Elena had responded immediately and appropriately the moment her absence had been discovered. Lady Bramwell's gaze flicked toward Elena as she entered the hall, her expression sharpening with obvious disapproval. She commented, her tone dripping with false politeness, that perhaps the presence of an unmarried young governess residing so intimately within the household, spending extended, unsupervised time alone with the Duke himself, might raise additional questions regarding the propriety and stability of Charlotte's current living arrangement. Elena felt heat rise sharply to her cheeks at the pointed insinuation, anger flaring hot and immediate within her chest. Before she could formulate an appropriately composed response, however, William stepped forward decisively, his voice carrying a firm authority Elena had not fully witnessed from him before. He stated clearly, without hesitation, that Elena's presence within the household had been entirely proper and enormously beneficial, that her dedication to Charlotte's education and well-being had brought genuine happiness and confidence into his sister's life that had been sorely lacking for far too long. He added, his voice hardening further, that any legal challenge attempting to use either the recent incident or Elena's presence as justification for removing Charlotte's guardianship would be vigorously and thoroughly contested, with the full weight of evidence demonstrating exactly how much genuine care and attention Charlotte received within her current home. Lady Bramwell's expression flickered with brief uncertainty at William's firm response, though she quickly recovered her composure, insisting that the courts would ultimately decide where the truth truly lay, and that she fully intended to pursue every available legal avenue regardless of William's objections. With that, she turned sharply and swept from the house, Edmund following closely behind, though he paused briefly at the door, glancing back toward Elena with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between apology and calculation. Once the unwelcome visitors had finally departed, the tension within the hall did not immediately ease. Margaret appeared quietly from a side hallway, her expression grave, informing William that a letter had arrived just that morning from the family's own solicitor, apparently having received word of yesterday's incident from another source entirely, likely one of the household staff sympathetic to Lady Bramwell's ambitions. William read the letter quickly, his expression growing increasingly troubled with each line, before finally setting it aside and addressing Elena directly. He explained that the solicitor had requested a formal meeting within the week to discuss the renewed guardianship challenge, and that gathering sufficient evidence demonstrating Charlotte's genuine well-being and the appropriateness of her current living situation would be essential in successfully countering Lady Bramwell's claims. Elena, despite her earlier fear regarding her own potentially complicating presence, found herself unwilling to simply retreat and leave William to face this battle alone. She offered immediately to provide whatever testimony or evidence might be needed, detailing Charlotte's remarkable progress in communication and confidence since her arrival, evidence that could only strengthen the argument that Charlotte's current environment was nurturing, rather than neglectful. William looked at her with visible surprise and gratitude, clearly having expected her to distance herself further, given the awkward insinuations Lady Bramwell had directed toward her. Instead, Elena found herself more determined than ever to fight alongside him, understanding now with complete clarity that her feelings for both William and Charlotte ran far deeper than she had initially allowed herself to acknowledge. Over the following days, the household transformed into a hub of careful preparation, gathering documentation, arranging testimonials from tenant farmers and household staff regarding Charlotte's happiness and William's dedicated care, and consulting extensively with their own solicitor regarding the strongest possible legal strategy moving forward. Throughout this stressful period, Elena and William found themselves working closely together, their earlier emotional tension gradually giving way to a renewed sense of partnership and mutual respect. Late one evening, after a particularly exhausting day of preparation, they found themselves alone once again in the study, surrounded by scattered papers and dwindling candlelight. William finally addressed the unresolved tension between them directly, apologizing once more thoroughly this time, for the deception he had maintained regarding his true identity. He explained with painful honesty that watching Lady Bramwell's cruel insinuations directed toward Elena had made him realize fully how much damage his earlier dishonesty could have caused, not only to their relationship, but to Elena's own reputation and standing. Elena, moved by his sincerity and having had ample time now to process her earlier hurt, admitted quietly that while the deception had genuinely wounded her, she understood now, more fully than before, the complicated fears that had driven his decision. She acknowledged that watching him fight so fiercely for both Charlotte's happiness and her own reputation over the past several days had done much to restore the trust that had been shaken. William, encouraged by her words, finally allowed himself to voice what he had been carefully holding back since their difficult conversation weeks earlier. He confessed that his feelings for Elena had grown far beyond simple gratitude or friendship, that he found himself hopelessly drawn to her honesty, her fierce protectiveness toward Charlotte, and her unwavering courage in standing beside him, despite every complication his true identity had introduced into her life. Elena felt her heart swell with an overwhelming mixture of relief and joy at his heartfelt confession, admitting in turn that her own feelings had grown similarly deep despite her earlier hurt and uncertainty. She said quietly that somewhere between that first stormy night and this exhausting, complicated present moment, she had fallen thoroughly and completely in love with the man before her, regardless of whether he introduced himself as Steward or Duke. The tender moment between them was interrupted, however, by an urgent knock at the study door, and Margaret entered quickly, her expression tight with fresh concern. She explained that a formal notice had just arrived by messenger, informing them that Lady Bramwell had successfully petitioned for an expedited court hearing, scheduled to take place in only 3 days' time, far sooner than anyone had anticipated. The sudden urgency shattered the tender atmosphere immediately, replaced by a fresh surge of anxious determination. William and Elena exchanged a serious glance, both understanding that the following 3 days would prove absolutely critical in securing Charlotte's future safety and happiness, regardless of whatever personal feelings had finally been openly acknowledged between them. With renewed resolve, they returned immediately to their preparations, working late into the night, alongside their solicitor, determined that when the court hearing finally arrived, they would present an overwhelming, undeniable case, demonstrating exactly how deeply Charlotte was loved, protected, and thriving within her current home, regardless of whatever cruel manipulations Lady Bramwell and her son might attempt to present in opposition. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, matching the tense mood that had settled over Ashford Hall since the notice arrived 3 days earlier. Elena dressed carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to accompany William and Charlotte to the county courthouse, where their entire future would be decided within the space of a single afternoon. Charlotte, dressed neatly and clearly nervous, clung tightly to Elena's hand as they climbed into the carriage, signing quietly that she was frightened, unsure whether the court would truly listen to her own wishes, or simply decide her fate based on assumptions about her deafness. Elena squeezed her hand reassuringly, signing back with confidence she did not entirely feel herself, promising that she and William would fight with everything they had to ensure Charlotte's voice was properly heard, regardless of how she chose to communicate it. The courthouse was already crowded with onlookers by the time they arrived, word of the unusual guardianship dispute having apparently spread through local society with considerable speed. Lady Bramwell sat confidently on the opposite side of the room, alongside Edmund and their solicitor, her expression carrying the same cold certainty Elena had witnessed during their earlier confrontation at the estate. The hearing began formally, with Lady Bramwell's solicitor presenting their case first, painting a deliberately exaggerated picture of neglect and instability within the household. He described the incident near the eastern cliffs in dramatic detail, suggesting Charlotte had nearly died due to inadequate supervision, and questioned pointedly why an unmarried young governess had been permitted to reside so intimately within the household for weeks on end, suggesting improper conduct that called the entire family's judgment into serious question. Elena felt her stomach twist painfully as the accusations mounted, watching the judge's expression carefully for any hint of how the arguments were being received. William remained remarkably composed throughout the presentation, his jaw tight but his posture confident, clearly having anticipated the exact nature of the attacks they would face. When it came time for their own solicitor to present their defense, the mood in the courtroom shifted noticeably. He called forward witness after witness, tenant farmers who spoke warmly of Charlotte's kindness and growing confidence, household staff who described William's unwavering dedication to his sister's well-being throughout the years, and finally, Margaret herself, who spoke movingly about the remarkable transformation she had personally witnessed in Charlotte since Elena's arrival, describing a young woman who had gone from isolated and withdrawn to vibrant, communicative, and genuinely happy. Elena was called forward next, her heart pounding as she took her place before the judge. She spoke honestly and clearly about her background, her natural fluency in sign language, and the immediate, powerful connection she had formed with Charlotte from their very first meeting. She described in detail the educational progress Charlotte had made, her growing confidence in expressing herself, and the deep, genuine love clearly evident between Charlotte and her brother throughout every interaction Elena had personally witnessed. When questioned directly about the nature of her relationship with William, Elena answered honestly, without shame or hesitation, admitting that their friendship had indeed grown into something deeper over recent weeks, but firmly stating that nothing about their conduct had ever been improper, and that her primary motivation throughout her time at Ashford Hall had always remained Charlotte's education, safety, and happiness above all else. The judge, an older man with sharp, observant eyes, listened carefully throughout Elena's testimony, before finally addressing Charlotte directly, asking, through Elena's careful interpretation, whether she felt safe, happy, and properly cared for within her current home, and whether she herself wished to remain under her brother's guardianship. Charlotte's hands moved with clear, unwavering conviction as she answered, her expression fierce despite the intimidating formality of the courtroom surrounding her. She signed that her brother had sacrificed his entire youth caring for her, that he had never once treated her deafness as a burden or limitation, and that the recent incident near the cliffs had resulted not from neglect, but from her own momentary emotional distress, caused entirely by her aunt and cousin's cruel manipulation and threats regarding her guardianship. She added, with visible determination, that Elena's arrival had given her something she had desperately lacked for years: genuine communication and connection with someone who saw her as a whole person, rather than a problem requiring management. She stated clearly that she wished to remain exactly where she was, with her brother and with Elena, both of whom she trusted completely with her future happiness and well-being. The judge listened to Elena's careful translation with visible consideration, occasionally glancing toward Lady Bramwell and Edmund, with an expression that suggested growing skepticism regarding their earlier claims. After a lengthy pause, during which the entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, the judge finally announced his decision. He ruled decisively in favor of William, dismissing Lady Bramwell's petition entirely, stating clearly that the evidence presented demonstrated not neglect, but exceptional, dedicated care for Charlotte's well-being, both from her brother and from the young woman who had brought genuine positive transformation into her life. He further noted, with pointed emphasis, that Charlotte's own clearly expressed wishes carried significant weight in his decision, reminding the courtroom that her deafness did not diminish her capacity to understand and communicate her own desires regarding her future. Relief flooded through Elena so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath her, and beside her, Charlotte's face broke into a brilliant, tearful smile of pure joy and relief. William embraced his sister tightly the moment the judge's ruling was formally recorded, before turning to Elena with an expression of overwhelming gratitude and love, pulling her into an embrace as well, careless of the watching crowd surrounding them. Lady Bramwell and Edmund departed the courthouse quickly afterward, their earlier confidence entirely deflated, disappearing from the family's life with considerably less fanfare than their dramatic legal challenge had promised. The carriage ride back to Ashford Hall felt entirely different from the tense journey that morning, filled instead with relieved laughter and joyful conversation between the three of them. Charlotte signed excitedly the entire way home, already planning celebrations, insisting that Elena must never even consider leaving, now that everything had been so wonderfully resolved. That evening, after a celebratory supper filled with genuine warmth and laughter throughout the household, William found a quiet moment to speak with Elena privately, in the same garden where their unlikely friendship had first properly begun weeks earlier. Under the soft glow of lantern light, surrounded by the same roses Charlotte had once shown her with such enthusiasm, William finally spoke the words that had been building steadily within him since that very first stormy night. He knelt before her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she had come to treasure deeply, and asked if she would consider staying not merely as Charlotte's teacher or as a welcomed guest, but as his wife, promising that regardless of title or circumstance, his heart had belonged to her honesty, her courage, and her boundless kindness since the very moment she had lifted her hands and signed good morning to his sister. unaware that the quiet man watching from the window above had already begun falling in love with everything she represented. Elena, tears of overwhelming happiness streaming freely down her face, answered without a single moment of hesitation, pulling him up into a warm, joyful embrace that needed no further words to convey her answer. Charlotte, watching from a nearby window with undisguised delight, immediately rushed outside to join them, signing enthusiastic congratulations before wrapping both of them in an exuberant embrace of her own. Finally, truly, surrounded by the family and happiness she had longed for throughout so many quiet, isolated years. The following morning, as golden sunlight spilled once again through the tall windows of Ashford Hall, Elena descended the staircase to find Charlotte waiting eagerly at the bottom, just as she had on that very first morning weeks earlier. This time, however, there was no confusion, no uncertainty, only pure joy, as Charlotte immediately lifted her hands, signing the same two simple words that had begun everything between them. Elena laughed, her heart overflowing with happiness, and signed the greeting back, before turning to find William watching them both from the doorway, his expression soft, with contentment and love. He stepped forward and lifted his own hands, carefully, deliberately, signing the same simple greeting, his skill noticeably improved from the many patient hours Elena and Charlotte had spent teaching him over recent weeks. "Good morning, Your Grace," Elena signed back, teasingly, her eyes sparkling with warmth and affection. William laughed freely, pulling her close, and the three of them stood together in the bright morning light, finally, completely, exactly where they belonged, their unlikely beginning transformed into a lasting, joyful future, built on honesty, patience, and a love that had grown from the simplest, most genuine gesture of kindness imaginable. The wedding took place at Ashford Hall itself, in early spring, when the gardens Elena had come to love so deeply were finally bursting with new blooms after the long winter months. Charlotte insisted on helping plan every detail, from the flowers lining the aisle to the small, carefully chosen touches that ensured she herself could fully participate in every moment of the celebration, rather than simply observing from the sidelines as she once might have during her years of isolation. William arranged for the ceremony to include a moment where the officiant paused deliberately, allowing Elena to sign the vows simultaneously with her spoken words, ensuring Charlotte could witness and understand every promise being exchanged between her brother and the woman who had transformed both their lives. It was a small gesture, but one that meant everything to Charlotte, who stood as Elena's chosen attendant, tears of joy streaming down her face throughout the entire ceremony. News of the unusual guardianship case had spread through the surrounding countryside in the months following the hearing, and rather than damaging the family's reputation, as Lady Bramwell had hoped, it instead earned them considerable respect and admiration among their neighbors and tenants. Several other families in the region, upon learning of Charlotte's remarkable progress, began seeking out proper instruction in sign language for their own deaf relatives, inspired by the genuine transformation they had witnessed within the Ashford household. Elena, now formally the Duchess of Ashford, found herself embracing her new role with the same quiet determination she had shown from her very first day at the estate. Rather than retreating into the sheltered life often expected of noble women, she established a small school on the estate grounds, dedicated to teaching sign language, not only to Charlotte's continued benefit, but to any interested members of the household staff, tenant families, and eventually, children from neighboring estates who had deaf siblings or relatives of their own. William, meanwhile, continued managing the estate with the same quiet dedication he always had, though he no longer needed to hide behind a false identity to do so. He often joked, in private moments with Elena, that he sometimes missed the simplicity of those early weeks, when she had known him only as a humble steward, free from the complications and expectations that came with his true title. Elena would always laugh at this, reminding him gently that she had fallen in love with his character long before she ever learned his name, and that nothing about his title had ever changed the man she cherished so deeply. Charlotte flourished remarkably in the years that followed, her confidence growing steadily as she took on increasing responsibility within the estate's daily operations, eventually becoming instrumental in managing correspondence and record-keeping alongside her brother, her sharp intelligence and careful attention to detail proving invaluable to the family's continued prosperity. She never forgot the frightening days surrounding the guardianship dispute, but she often spoke of them afterward not with lingering fear, but with quiet gratitude, recognizing that the crisis had ultimately brought her closer to both her brother and her beloved sister-in-law than she had ever imagined possible. Lady Bramwell and Edmund faded gradually from the family's life, their earlier ambitions thoroughly extinguished by the humiliating defeat they had suffered in court. Occasional reports reached Ashford Hall over the years, suggesting their own fortunes had declined considerably, though William, true to his generous nature, never wished them genuine ill will, simply grateful that their scheming had ultimately failed to harm the family he loved so fiercely. Years later, when Elena and William welcomed their first child into the world, a daughter with her mother's bright, curious eyes, Charlotte was among the very first to hold the newborn, her hands immediately beginning to teach the infant simple signs, long before the child could form her first spoken words. Determined that this new generation would grow up fluent in both languages from the very beginning, never experiencing the isolation and loneliness Charlotte herself had once known so intimately. The old stone bench in the hidden garden, dedicated so long ago to William and Charlotte's mother, became a favorite gathering place for the growing family in the years that followed, a quiet reminder of the losses and struggles that had shaped their early lives, now surrounded by laughter, love, and the steady, unshakable bond that had grown from a single, simple gesture exchanged between strangers on a rainy, uncertain morning. Elena often reflected, in quiet moments throughout her long and happy life at Ashford Hall, on how differently everything might have unfolded had her carriage wheel never broken that stormy night, had she never climbed that long hill toward the glowing lights of an unfamiliar house, had she never lifted her hands instinctively to greet a lonely, deaf young woman waiting patiently at the bottom of a grand staircase. It had been such a small thing, really, 2 simple words offered without hesitation or expectation of reward, "Good morning." Yet those 2 words had opened a door to a life she could never have imagined for herself, filled with genuine love, purpose, and belonging, proving that sometimes the most ordinary gestures of kindness carry the power to change everything, transforming strangers into family, and turning an accidental detour into the truest, most meaningful home she had ever known.